Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to be discussing Spinoza on the infinite. In particular, looking at his letter on the infinite in order to get a sense of the general contours of Spinoza's philosophy. Last time we talked about some basic epistemic categories in Spinoza's philosophy, and we learned there that he takes over the Cartesian epistemic categories of clarity and distinctness and develops his own distinctive epistemic category of adequacy. We're going to see today that this idea of adequacy figures in quite heavily into how he builds what you could generally call his metaphysical picture of the world. So if Descartes, for example, we previously characterized as a kind of dualist philosopher and an interactionist philosopher who held that there were two and only two kinds of finite substances, then what do we call Spinoza? In this video, I propose that we call Spinoza a monist. In other words, while Descartes thought that there were two kinds of substances, two classes of substances, Spinoza is going to argue quite consistently that there is one substance, namely God or the world. This is as I mentioned last time, the sort of catchphrase of his philosophy, Deus sive natura, God or nature. You can call it either of those things. That one substance that is the entirety of the world. Spinoza's way of putting this, that he doesn't quite say here, although we will get into it next week, in his Ethics in Book 1, Proposition 15, whatever is in God. So God is the one and only substance that is the universe. God is not only the efficient cause of the universe in the sense that, like, he created it, like how, a watchmaker creates a watch or something like that, but that God is in fact the material cause of the world, that God in an important way is the world, that the world is made up of God. Now that's a radical vision of the world in reality, but I think that at least what I hope is that I can convince you over the next couple of weeks that it's actually quite plausible and especially modern, right? It's important that we don't think about Spinoza as a kind of superstitious, mystical, oneness sort of character. Although he is quite into discussing the oneness of the universe and God and so on, he believes that we have strictly rational knowledge of God in the universe. And this motivates Spinoza to believe, for instance, that to love God is to study nature, right? The surest way to go about knowing God is to know the world around us, which is God. In other words, you learn a lot more about God through the study of natural science, Galilean style natural science especially, than you would gain from, for example, reading the Bible or any other kind of holy book. Hopefully you can see why this is a quite challenging conception of God for the European religions of the time. Now, an essential part of Spinoza's claim is going to be that God, as the sole substance of the universe, is infinite. And it's exactly in virtue of its infinity that secures, in an important way, its unity. So if we want to explain Spinoza's pantheistic conception of the world, according to which everything is God, right, or is an affection of God, as we're going to see, then we will need to discuss the nitty-gritty of his conception of the infinite. Now, I want to start off this discussion by mentioning that short selection from Descartes' The Principles of Philosophy that's going to be particularly relevant for motivating Spinoza's thinking about substance and the infinite. You will recall that substance is a very important word for Descartes. I mean, it describes the basic building blocks of the universe. You want a description of what exists? Well, you need a description of what kinds of substances there are. And one of the most distinctive aspects of Descartes' philosophy is his strict dualism. So his belief that there are two distinct classes or kinds of substances. Now, the Principles of Philosophy is a later work by Descartes. In it, he's sort of like summarizing his own philosophical method and worldview, as well as proposing his own system of physics and optics and all of that good stuff. It's really, really interesting. If you ever have the time, I do recommend trying to trudge through it on your own. But I've gone through and done the dirty work for you in this case and found what is one of the most revealing passages in all of Descartes' philosophy. In this part of the Principles of Philosophy, Descartes is trying to explain his conception of substance. So what makes something a substance? What we previously said is that modifications or affections, we can otherwise just say changes, inhere within the substance, right? So when the fire gets hot, right, what is the thing that's getting hot? Well, it's the fire, right? The fire is the substance. Getting hot is one of its modes or modifications, its changes. And that's how you know what a substance is it follows our basic, ordinary way that we go about predicating things of things, right? We say things are fast or thin or what have you, right? And the bearer of the property is the substance. But this raises a sort of related question of like, well, what qualifies something to have properties? In other words, what about substance makes certain kinds of properties or characteristics inherent in them, right? Another way to put this is, okay, yes, modifications inherent in substances, but what makes it so that that can happen, right? What makes a substance a substance? And Descartes' answer is relatively simple: independence, right? When I say that the fire gets hot, part of what I mean is that the heat, the getting hot, is contained within this thing in the world, namely the fire, right? And that doesn't mean that other things in the room are necessarily getting hot, right? The things in my refrigerator, for example, are not getting hot, right? So there's a relative kind of independence of the fire and the objects surrounding them, right? That allows the fire to take on certain properties or characteristics and the other objects not to do so. So what makes something a substance? Well, just that it's independent of other stuff, right? This can be bottle-shaped and this can be not bottle-shaped, for example. And they're independent bearers of these properties, and that's what makes them substances on Descartes' account. However, Descartes has to add a little qualification here, because he says, well, okay, but if you think about substance in that way, then really there's only one substance, namely God, because everything that exists through the continual creation of God, and moreover, that, you know, the existence of the universe as a whole, right, is caused by God, right? And so while it seemed like these everyday objects had a kind of independence, they had an independence from other finite stuff, but they didn't have an independence from the infinite, or what Descartes will call absolute substance, or in other words, the only thing that really actually qualifies as a substance, namely God, right? Strictly speaking, these other things are not substances in the most robust sense of that term, because all of them depend on God. essentially, what happens with Spinoza is if you take that thought and you turn it to 11, in other words, you accept what Descartes himself, kind of readily recognized as a natural implication of his way of putting things, but one that he didn't adopt himself, namely that there's one and only one substance that is God, because that's the only thing in the universe that is genuinely independent. Everything else depends on God in an important sense, right? And part of what's going on in Spinoza is he's changing how we think about that dependence of things on God, right? Descartes thought of it as a kind of causal process. Spinoza is going to argue that the essence of everything is directly dependent on the essence of God, right? And it's going to turn on a very, very complex philosophical argument, right? But it's a very, very interesting picture of the universe. There's really only one God that is going through infinite amount of changes constantly all the time, right? So this bottle is just God, bottle-wise, as it were. This is God chapstick-wise, right? I am God in the penny way, right? The way that God expresses itself as a particular individual, namely penny, right? And so too, everything in the universe is just but another kind of expression of God's infinite, eternal essence, right? Very, very interesting, almost mystical sounding picture of the universe. But one thing that is very interesting, very modern about Spinoza's picture is because God is supremely rational, everything about the universe is supremely rational. We can know everything that there is to know about the universe, right? While I might not be in a position to, for example, have firsthand experience of what the universe was like over 1 million years ago, right? I can just never occupy that standpoint. In principle, there's nothing mysterious, unknowable, any of that stuff in the universe. Really, really radical aspect of Spinoza's rationalism. Spinoza thinks that the only reason why his view is not the mainstream view, why his view of God and the universe is not the ordinary everyday conception of God in the universe, is that we ordinarily operate with a very confused conception of the infinite, right? And if we can clarify our conception of the infinite, we can see why the Spinozistic picture of there being one and only one substance is necessarily true, right? And this is something that we're going to investigate in this video, but it's also something that we're going to talk a lot about in the next video. We're actually going to get into the argument that he presents in his masterwork, The Ethics. But let's go ahead and get started. For Spinoza, there are three distinct things that we tend to mean whenever we say the infinite, right? And we're going to go from, once again, the most superficial view, right, to the deepest view. The most superficial view of the infinite is to confuse it with the merely indefinite, right? So say I have like a jar of M&Ms or something like that, right? You can't visually see how many there are, right? And you just kind of eventually go uncountably many, right? This happens in many kinds of processes, even though sometimes we wouldn't be tempted to say, there's an infinite number of M&Ms in that jar, for example. We conceive of the infinite on the model of the indefinitely or uncountably large numbers, right? And hopefully you can see where Spinoza is going for this, because it's very, very similar to Descartes' argument about the Kiliagon, is that this is an imaginary way of relating to the infinite, right? When we try to imagine the infinite, we can't actually do that. So what we do is we try to imagine uncountably many, right? And this is the indefinite on Spinoza's conception. If you think about the infinite in this way, then the infinite seems like something really, really contingent, right? It's something that changes and constantly changes. And so on, right? It's also something that is inherently countable, right? I mean, it's made up of units and so on. So this is a superficial way of thinking about the infinite, and it's reflected in items of religious worship where God is characterized as, for example, taller or mightier or so on than we could see or understand, right? It's an attempt to characterize what Spinoza thinks is rightly the infinity of God, but doing so in an inappropriate, ultimately imaginative way. Now, a related kind of semi-rational way of thinking about the infinite is to think about the infinite in what Spinoza calls infinite in virtue of its cause, right? So this isn't stuff that's essentially infinite. It's things that are infinite in virtue of their cause being infinite. So think about, for example, the number of events in the universe, right? The number of events in the universe is infinite because of its cause, the cause of those events, namely the universe itself. Think about the infinite expanse of space, right? That's something that's infinite in virtue of what makes up or causes existence in the first place for Spinoza, which is God, right? So this is a conception that is rational. Spinoza is ultimately going to say, yes, there are infinitely many events in exactly the way that this view tries to say, but he wants to say that it's easy to mischaracterize this kind of infinite because we regularly occlude, right, its dependence on what is really essentially infinite, right? So this is the unessentially infinite, right? It happens to be infinite, but it could have been finite, right? Is contrasted with that which is infinite in virtue of its essence, what is essentially infinite. And this is God, or the one and only substance of the universe, right? And it's from thinking about God's infinity rather than the infinity of numbers or events or so on that gives us the essence of the infinite, right? An adequate conception of the infinite. Now, to really clarify Spinoza's view, Spinoza develops this distinction between substance and mode, right? We should already be familiar with this distinction as it emerges in Descartes. Modes are modifications, so they're changes that inhere within the substance, right? But in this case, substance is taken to be the one and only thing that exists, right? And in virtue of substance existing, all of its modifications exist, right? But substance essentially exists and modifications do not essentially exist, right? Spinoza buys into a version of the ontological argument. Existence belongs to the nature of substance. And this has to do with substance's infinitude, right? One way to characterize the nature of the absolutely infinite is as broking no kind of limitation. In other words, the absolutely infinite is that which in its essence cannot be limited, right? One way to maybe characterize the principle of sufficient reason is that for anything to exist or not exist, there needs to be a reason why, right? And because substance is essentially unlimited, there's nothing that could even conceivably limit or prevent the existence of the substance, right? This is in contrast to modes or modifications, or what we would normally just call everyday stuff, right? There are very many things that limit my existence, right? If, for example, I were to inhale a lot of poisonous gas, for example, that would be something that would impede my existence. It would cause my existence to end, right? And so you could say that there are certain kinds of limitations I have, right? I can't breathe poison gas. I also can't breathe water, right? I can also be run over by a steamroller, right? All of these possibilities, all of these limitations pertain to my essence, right? Similarly, for example, if my mother was not born, right, then I would not be born, right? And so my existence takes place under a certain kind of condition. By contrast, God's existence, it's not even conceivable for there to be a condition on that. In other words, God unconditionally exists. We're going to see a more in-depth argument to this extent, but hopefully you can see how Spinoza's reasoning about the infinite here closely models the ontological argument as we saw it in Descartes. Now, importantly, substance isn't a composition. In other words, substance is not like just a grouping of a bunch of events, right? So substance, because it can't be limited in any way, it can't be divided, right? There can't be things that are more essential than it that compose it, right? It can't have parts. And in virtue of not having any limitations, and in virtue of its simplicity that necessarily follows from its infinity, it is essentially one, right? Whereas all modes, all modifications are composed of further modifications, and they are by nature divisible. So like for me, like you could divide up my body is composed of various parts, right? You could ask in terms of some unit like pounds or something like that, how many parts of me there are, and so on, right? God then is infinite, right? It belongs to the essence of substance, that there be nothing that limits it, right? In other words, its essence causes its existence. Existence pertains to its essence, right? Whereas, for example, the number of modes is infinite, right? But you can only understand that infinity if you can understand that infinity as dependent on an essential way on the absolutely infinite nature of substance. Now, that was a lot of philosophical terminology, but the basic picture is this. There's one world that we all inhabit, that we can call God, or we can call nature, or what have us. And in this world, there are an infinite number of events that we'll call modes or modifications. These are things like human beings, the everyday objects around us, and even microscopic kinds of processes. These infinite events depend on an essential way on the one world that they are a part of. And we can see them as expressions of, but not parts of, the essence of God, right? And we're going to elaborate this metaphysical picture in a lot more depth, but hopefully we can see the major point that God, or substance on Spinoza's picture, is essentially infinite and eternal, whereas modes are finite and exist at a particular point in time because they have conditions. Substance is unconditional, modes are conditional. Substance is infinite, modes are finite, and then can accumulate to an infinite number. And so they're infinite in virtue of their cause, aka God. This was a lot of dense stuff, and it's very, very difficult, but we're going to keep trying to trudge through this material and try to get a strong understanding of Spinoza together. Next week, we're going to be looking at Book 1 and a little bit of Book 2 of Spinoza's Ethics. I very much look forward to hearing what you think. See you in the next video.